Let's learn CSS by creating 10 projects together. During the next 10 projects, you will learn everything you need to know to build beautiful things with only HTML and CSS. We will build things like accordions, glass morphism forms, particle effects, nav bars, and a lot more together. Today, we create this cool card effect inside of HTML and CSS. First of all, let's start by creating a container with the class of card. And inside of this card container, we have another container that has the class of inner. And inside of this inner card, basically, we have two more containers, and one is the class of .front, which is the front of the card. And the second div has the class of .back, or basically back, which is the back of the card. And now we can basically have an h2 inside of here and say my skills, and we probably have a short paragraph that includes or contains 50 words. We are just going to generate some random words. Now we'll copy those lines in here, and for the h2 we say my sister, for example, for whatever reason. So basically this is the front of our card and this is going to be the back of our card. So let's go inside of CSS and start to style our cards. First of all, let's style our card. Let's say we want to have a color of white, a font family of monospace, and let's just save that and let's use text align of center. So now this is the front and this is the back of our card. So let's keep going by targeting our front and our back of the card, and let's say we want to have a back face visibility of hidden, because now once the back face, or basically once the back of our card or of a card shows, it is basically hidden, which will basically mean I'm going to show it to you once I use .back, and I'm going to set transform rotate Y to 180 degrees, which basically means we are going to rotate this card to the back, because we're going to rotate it by 180 degrees. 360 degrees are basically a complete round, and 180 degrees basically means you take a paper, for example, and you rotate that paper to the back. And once we save this, this container here is basically hidden because we rotated it to the back, and back face visibility says that once it shows the back face of something, this thing basically gets hidden. Hope that was understandable. Nevertheless, we now want to have a background for our element. So let's say background, for example, let's use red. And now we have this red background color. But let's define different backgrounds for our back and our front page. So now let's go to .front and let's say we have a background of Rebecca Purple, but that looks terrible. So we're going to create a conic gradient by saying we want to use RGB of 000 and we want to go to RGB of 000. We're going to save this. Now I obviously choose a slightly different color, and I want to have maybe something like this. And now I can obviously also say our first color should go from 0 degrees to 180 degrees. And our second color should go from 180 degrees to 360 degrees. And now we basically have this effect, and I think it looks pretty cool. Maybe I should go to 14 for this one, so it gets slightly closer to the other color. And now like this, it looks pretty cool in my opinion. So now we want to basically rotate this area once you hover over the card. So we are going to say, okay, .card, and once you hover over the card, we want to do something to .inner, because .inner basically includes our front and our back. And once the user hovers over our card, we basically just want to rotate the entire card, so front and back, by 180 degrees, which basically means we are going to do transform inside of our .inner a container, and we'll say rotate Y by 180 degrees to flip the entire card. And as you can see, this one flips the card and it looks terrible, because we need another option when inside of the .inner container by using transform style preserve 3D. And this basically means once we rotate .inner, which we do right here, or transform .inner, we want to preserve the 3D style, and it should basically keep that into consideration. And now once we hover, you can see it has my sister right here and my skills right here. Obviously still looks terrible, so we are going to use a perspective of 1000 pixels, and it doesn't change too much. And the next thing we are going to do is use our position of relative to for our card container, and now we are going to use position absolute inside of our .front and .back element. Now let's also add a padding of 40 pixels, for example. Now it looks like this. Obviously this still doesn't really look perfect, but we can, for example, say that we want to copy this conic gradient, and we're going to copy and paste this one to the back face, but we want to use some white colors, for example, for the back side of our card. So maybe let's use this, and now it basically looks like this. Obviously it would probably make sense to use a black color for the text inside of our backside, and now it looks like this. Now let's say that the width of our card is probably 400 or 500 pixels, like this, and now we get this effect already, which looks pretty cool in my opinion. Maybe we could say that this one is probably slightly darker, and now we have this effect, and I think it looks really pretty good. Now we could also say, okay, for front and back, let's use a border radius of 10 pixels. So now we have rounded borders, still looks pretty cool. And I also want to use a transition for .inner. So once we hover over the card, I basically want to have a smooth transition between those two states, if you want to say so. So we want to basically use all, 0.5 seconds, and let's say ease. And now once we hover, we basically get this cool flip effect. And as you can see, if I have perspective of 1000 pixels, it looks like a cool 3D effect. And if I remove perspective of 1000 pixels, it looks, yeah, kind of weird to me, to be honest, because it doesn't really look 3D anymore. So I really recommend to use this 3D perspective property to make it, yeah, really look pretty cool. So obviously it looks kind of right, but it's not perfect yet. So let's do H2 of margin bottom, and let's say we want to have 10 pixels, for example. Looks a little bit better already. And let's now use an animated border to animate the border behind our card, if you want to say so. So let's go ahead and target our dot front by using colon after, and now we say we want to have a content that is basically empty. We want to use a background that is red for now, let's say that. And now let's also say we want to have a position of absolute, and now we want to use inset of -3 pixels, and now we have this background basically. So yeah, looks kind of terrible, but it is what it is for now. Let's now use a conic gradient again, and now let's say for this conic gradient we want to use our background color. So we are going to go up to our body and we'll copy our background color. We'll take this background color, and you'll see in a second what it's going to do. We're going to paste it in a couple of times here, as often as you basically want. And this looks pretty terrible for now, but let's say we want to use yellow after we use the background color twice. Let's say we want to use red for this one here, and now let's paste another background here, and let's use blue for the third color. And what this basically does, it just says, okay, create a gradient that has two parts of the regular background color, as you can see. Then one part of yellow, two parts of the regular background color, one part of red, two parts of the regular background color, and one part of blue. And by doing so, it really looks like the colors are basically fading into the background. Now it obviously looks kind of terrible, so I'm going to use set index of -1 to push it behind the card. And by doing so, we basically get this cool effect already. So let's now say we want to have a border radius of 10 pixels as well, because our card has a border radius of 10 pixels as well. And now I want to use -1 pixel for the inset, because this makes the border slightly more subtle, if you want to say so. Now we need to animate this border to make it look like really, really cool. And we can do so by using a simple trick. We are going to use from variable --angle, and this angle basically says what the angle of the gradient is, and we need to change this angle. And we can change this angle by, first of all, creating a property by using a property, and then we say we want to define the property --angle. We are going to define a syntax, and the syntax is obviously the angle syntax. We want to use an initial value, and since we want to start from 0 degrees and go to 360 degrees, the initial value is 0 degrees, and then we want to use an inherits property that says false. And now we can use this angle to animate an animation by using add keyframes, and as an identifier we can say rotate, Now we want to start from an angle of 0 degrees and we want to go to an angle of 360 degrees. And this is basically our animation. So now we need to say our front after element needs to get an animation, and we say the animation is rotate over a time span of 8 seconds. Now we want to have a linear transformation, and we also want to have an infinite loop right here, so it basically loops forever. And now we basically see we have this animation for our background, or if you want to say for our border. Now we can copy and paste this once more, and we use a filter of blur of maybe 2 pixels or 3 pixels. And as you can see, this basically adds a blur. I think the blur is a little bit too strong, so we're going to use 1 pixel for the blur. And now we have this blur behind or in front of our elements, if you want to say so. And we are going to use before for this one. And now it basically looks like this. Obviously, we can make this card look a little bit better by going to SVG icons, for example, and then we are just going to SVG repo or whatever you want to do. Then you can, for example, use whatever icon you want, and we are going to go for skills, for example. Let's just say we want to use this icon. I'm going to download this icon. I'm going to drag this icon into our folder. I'm going to rename this to skills, for example. I'm going to right click here and press open with, and we are going to open it with the text editor. We're going to copy this line right here, and now we are going to paste this one right above our my skills header. We're going to save the file, and now it should look pretty weird because most of the time those icons are way too big. So we're going to decrease the size to 40 pixels, for example, right here inside of the icon, and we're going to use 40 pixels for the height as well. And now we have this icon. Obviously the color doesn't really look too good, so we can go in here, and usually you can change the color by using the fill property, and you can, for example, say that you want to use FFF, which is usually just white. And as you can see, we now have this white icon. We can also use a class that says SVG to style this SVG icon. Now we can go inside of our CSS file, we can target our .svg and say we want to have a margin bottom of maybe 20 pixels, or let's say 40 pixels, for example. Whatever you want, it doesn't really matter. I'm not going to waste too much time with this, but you can obviously choose a value that suits your needs, basically. And this is how you can create this card inside of HTML and CSS. Today I'll show you how to create this modern glassmorphism register form. If you want to use the exact same background, feel free to just copy this background code right here. First of all, we need to go into our HTML file and create a form inside of our body. And inside of this form, we can, for example, say that we want to have an H2 that could, for example, say register here, for example. Now let's target our form inside of CSS and say our form should have a padding of 40 pixels, for example. We want to have a border of 1 pixel solid white, and now we have this effect. Let's go with 60 pixels, for example. Let's say we want to have a border radius of 15 pixels, so we have round borders. And now we can use the glassmorphism effect by using a background that is basically white, that has RGBA of 0.1 and is black, but we need to use white, so we're going to use 255 instead of 0 for R, G, and B, and now we have this effect basically already. Now what we can also do is we create a filter that says we want to have a blur of 10 pixels, for example. But to really add this blur, we need to use, instead of filter, we need to use backdrop filter. And as you can see, now we have it behind our card. Now let's also start to style our form by using form H2. We want to have a color of white. We want to have a font size of maybe 40 pixels. So now we have this effect already. Let's say we want to have a font family for everything of maybe Roboto. And in order to do so, we are going to go to Google Fonts, and we are going to get the Roboto font by clicking on the page. We're creating get font, get embed code. We're using those links. We're going to copy and paste them into our HTML file. We'll copy this font family right here that says Roboto. We're going to save the file. We'll add this to our body as well. And now we have font family of Roboto. So now we have this one, and we somehow got the story, which we obviously don't want. So now we have this register form. Instead of register here, we can just say register, for example. So now we need some input fields. And in order to do so, first of all, we are going to give our form field a certain width of maybe 500 pixels, like so. We say text align of center. Oops, text minus align center. So now we have it centered, and now we are going to add the input field. So now we'll add an input of type email, for example, and we say this email ID is email and placeholder is email, for example. Next up, we're going to add an input field for our username that has the type of text. This name is username, ID is username, placeholder is username. And now we do the same for our password. So input of type password, name is password, ID is password, and placeholder is obviously also password, like so. Now we also need a submit button, so we can use button of type submit, for example. We say this is register right here, and maybe we also want to have a text that says already have an account question mark, and if you have an account, you can just go ahead and go to our login form, like so. So now we'll first of all put those ones into a div, and this should work. So now we'll target all of our input fields inside of our form field, and we'll give them a width of 100%. By doing so, we say we want to have padding top bottom of maybe 10 pixels and 20 pixels to the left right. Or let's just use 20 pixels for all of those directions. Let's maybe say 15, like so. Now we say our border is basically 1 pixel, solid and white. We want to have a border radius of maybe 5 pixels. For our form, we are going to use a display of flex, a flex direction of column, and a gap of 5 pixels to get a gap between our items. So this already looks a lot better. Now for our inputs, we also say we want to have a background. And now let's say again RGBA 255, 255, 255, and 0.1 once again. We can also go for 0.2, for example, so it doesn't really matter. Maybe I'm going to remove the border as well because I don't really think it fits here. But instead, we're going to say we want to have border of 0, and we also want to have a box shadow, for example, of, let's say, 5 pixels X direction, 3 pixels Y direction, 10 pixels blur, and we are going to use RGBA of 0, 0, 0, and 0.1. So some form of black. So we get this effect. And maybe I'm going to increase the gap to 10 pixels. Now we obviously also want to target our placeholder. So we're going to go to form input : placeholder, and we say we want to have a color of white. And now we're just going to decrease the opacity slightly for those placeholders to maybe 0.6, like so. And as you can see, if we write in, it still looks pretty terrible. So what we have to do in order to get rid of this, we also need to give our input fields an outline of none and a color of white, because we want to have white text right here. And as you can see, now we have white text. And maybe I'm going to use 12 pixels instead of 10 pixels, so this looks a little bit better. Now we can start to style our button by using form button, for example. Again, we are going to use a width of 100%. We use a padding of maybe just 15 pixels, a border of 0, a border radius of 5 pixels again. Let's use a font minus size of 20 pixels, or let's say we want to have 16 pixels. We can obviously also use a background of RGBA 255, 255, 255, 0.2, for example. So now we would have this bottom. We could use a color of white, like so, a cursor of pointer, and now we have this bottom. So now let's also start to target our container. Let's just give this one a class of container, and we're going to target .container. We give it a display of flex. We say justify content center, gap maybe 5 pixels to get a little gap. And now we are also going to use a color of white for our text. And we obviously also need to target our href specifically, and we can, for example, give it a class of white and bold and underline none. And we don't have those classes yet, but we are going to create them in a second. And we say, okay, we want to have dot white will have color of white. We will have dot bold will have a font weight of bold, and underline none will have text decoration of none. And now we save this and we have this effect as well. Now we could, for example, add some margin by using or by creating the class mt-4, for example, and giving this one a margin top of 40 pixels. And now we give mt4 maybe to our first input field, for example. So we say mt-4. So now we have a margin here. And now this might be a little bit too much, so we're going with 30, and now we have this effect, for example. But maybe we are going to remove text decoration none or underline none right here. And now we have this underlined login button. And this is what the finished result basically looks like. Today I show you how to create this cool accordion effect only using HTML and CSS. To get started, we're going to create a div with the class of accordion. And inside of this accordion class, we're going to create another div that has the class of accordion minus header, and another one that has the class of accordion minus body minus container. And inside of this container class, we are going to create another div that has the class of accordion minus body. So this is basically the setup that we are going to need. Inside of the header, we can basically write any text. So maybe hover me to open, for example. So this could be the text, for example. And inside of this accordion body, we can now use some text. So we could, for example, say, let's use lorem 50 to just create some placeholder text. So now we have those placeholders. Let's start to style our accordion header and our accordion by saying dot accordion, and it will have a width of 500 pixels, for example, or let's say 400 for this one. Now we are going to style our accordion header as well, and we'll say that we want to have a font size, for example, of 40 pixels. Now we want to have a font minus family of Franklin Gothic, for example, and let's use a background of white, like so. Then let's also give this some padding of maybe 20 pixels and a border radius of maybe 5 pixels. Let's give our entire accordion some margin to the top of maybe 80 pixels to just make it look a little better for this demo. So now once we hover over this, we want to see this text. So by default, this text should basically be hidden. And once you hover over this text, we want to open the accordion. So what we can do in order to do so is obviously first create cursor of pointer to get this cool pointer effect. Now we are going to go into our index.html. We're going to grab this accordion body container, and we'll target this accordion body container. We'll say that this one should have a display of grid. And in order to make this one invisible, we basically use grid template rows, and we say that the height of one of those rows is 0fr, so 0 fractions basically. And now we are going to take our accordion body, and inside of this accordion body, we are going to say overflow of hidden, because obviously the overflow should be hidden. And now as you can see, our overflow is hidden. So what we need to do next is basically target our accordion header. And let's say once we hover over our accordion header, so once we hover over this container, we want to target our accordion body container, so basically the body. And we use the plus symbol because we want to use the sibling, obviously, because the accordion body container is a sibling of the accordion header. So we can use the plus sign, and we are going to say grid template rows is 1fr right now. And as you can see, now we see the text. Obviously the animation is still terrible, so we'll change that next. We're going to say instead of our accordion body container, we'll have a transition of maybe all 0.5 seconds and use ease, for example. And as you can see, now the text slowly appears, but this still doesn't look perfect. So let's say for accordion body container, we also want to use a background of white, for example, like so. Now we also want to use a padding of 20 pixels, but actually, whoops, padding. So, and now we have this padding. Now let's also use a border radius of 5 pixels. And I think we need to put the padding to our hover state, basically, like so. And as you can see, this is basically the effect right now. Let's also use a different font size, and maybe let's use 30 pixels for that one, and also maybe 30 pixels for that one. Let's use 30, 20 top bottom and 30 left right, like so. And now this looks pretty good already. Now let's also use a margin minus top of 5 pixels and margin minus bottom of maybe 5 pixels as well. So now we get this cool effect where we have a little gap between our items. And as you can see, this looks pretty much alright already to me. So what we can do next is we can just go ahead and use this accordion container, and we just add some more containers. And now we basically have those effects. Obviously this still looks pretty bad, so we are going to say that our entire accordion will get a display of flex direction of column and a gap of maybe 5 pixels. And now we have this gap between those items. And now once we hover over the item, we're basically going to open, we're basically going to open one of our containers, and this is the finished result. And obviously you can spend a lot of time on styling, but I think for this demo, this definitely works. And if you wanted to, you could also add like an icon to the right, for example. And now you could obviously also add like buttons or style the accordion in whatever way you'd like. And this would work. Today I'll show you how to create this responsive navbar inside of HTML and CSS. Actually, this is really easy. We are just going to create a nav container, and inside of this container we are going to create an anchor tag. Inside of our first anchor tag we can say home, for example. Then we can duplicate this anchor tag a couple of times, as often as you basically want. And let's say in our second anchor tag we have the text mission. Right here we have jobs, for example. Then we have an about section and a contact page. We're going to save this, and now we basically have this navigation bar. Let's go into CSS and start to style it. Let's create, or let's target our nav element, and let's say we want to have display of grid, and we want to have grid template columns of repeat 5 1fr. So each of these grid elements basically takes the same amount of space, and we have 5 elements since we have 5 pages basically. Hope that makes sense up to this point. Now let's start to style our anchor tags inside of our nav bar. And let's say we have a color of white, we have a text decoration of none, we have a font family of monospace. You can obviously choose whatever font family you want to use. Let's use a font size of 16 pixels. And let's say it works like that. Obviously now it looks like we just have 4 columns, but we can change that by using position of relative on this element. And now we have to add another element right here, which is a div element, and we say that this div has the class of color. And this class name doesn't really matter, choose whatever you want. But now we are going to use .color to target our color element, and we say this color element has a position of absolute and an inset of 0, which basically means top, left, bottom, and right is 0. And let's say we want to have a background of red, for example, or yeah, red is fine. And now we basically have this background. Now we obviously need to change the width of our .color selector, or of this div, to be fair. And let's say we want to have a width, and we are going to calculate this width based on the entire width. So we are going to say 100% divided by 5, because we have 5 columns basically. And as you can see, now one of those columns, or basically our color div, takes up the width of exactly 1 column. So basically exactly the width of 1 anchor tag. Now let's say this entire nav bar has a width of 80% of the total width. And as you can see, now our grid is spaced evenly and looks pretty good. Obviously this one here doesn't look too good, but we're going to fix this one next. So let's say we have a set index of -1 to push this color right behind of our nav bar text. And we're going to save it, and now our color is right behind our text. Still doesn't look too good, but it's getting there. So now let's say we have a text, a line of center to center our text. And now we can also say we want to have a padding to the top and the bottom of 20 pixels and 0 to the left and right. And now it looks like this. And this is a lot better already. And now we could also say we want to have a border radius of maybe 5 pixels. So we have like round edges, but we would actually need to use this border radius for our shape, obviously. And now we have this one right here. So let's use a linear gradient instead of a flat color, and say we want to have an angle for the linear gradient of 90 degrees, and we're going to use RGBA of 0001, for example. And then we'll copy our RGBA values and paste them in 2 more times. And now we can define a gradient that goes to a pretty blue color, like this. We're going to take those values, we're going to paste them in here, and we'll say that we want to have probably 0.5 for the opacity. And we'll paste them in here again, and we'll say we want to have 0.1 for the opacity. And now it basically looks like this already. It looks a lot better already. And for the last step, we basically need to animate our color selector once we hover over a certain link. And now let's say once we hover over an anchor tag, and to be precise, once we hover over the first child of an anchor tag, so the first element, we want to create a hover effect, and once we hover over that element, we want to change something inside of our color container. Now, let's say we want to animate our transform property, and we want to be precise, change our translate X property, and we want to set this one to 0%, because once we hover over the first child, we obviously want to be in the beginning of our navigation bar. So let's copy this entire code, paste it in here, and let's say once we hover our second child, which is basically this child, we want to move our box 100% to the right. And as you can see, nothing is going to happen right here. And the reason for this is that we need to use the sibling selector, because obviously color is not a child, but rather a sibling of our A tags. And now we save it, and as you can see, it jumps from left to right. And now we are going to paste this in and do the same for pretty much every other element. Let's say this is the 4th child and this is the 5th child. And obviously we also need to adjust our percentages. This is like 400%, 300%, 200%, and once we save and hover over all of the links, it's basically working already, but we could add a transition to make it a little smoother. So let's go into the color container, say transition of all 0.25 seconds and ease. And now we basically have this effect, and this is exactly what we are looking for. Today we learn how to create this animated progress bar inside of HTML and CSS. So let's go. To get started, let's create a div with the class of container, and inside of this div we're going to create another div with the class of bar. Now we're going to go into CSS, and we are going to target our bar by using .bar, and we'll give it a background color of blue, for example, and a width of 100% and a height of 40 pixels. In order to see our bar, we also need to target our container class. So we go inside of our container and we say that our container has a width of 100%. Now we save the document and we have this bar, which obviously looks terrible. So let's replace this blue color by using a gradient. So we go online and say CSS gradient generator, because this is, in my opinion, the easiest and fastest way to create a good gradient for CSS. And I think those colors look pretty good. So I'm just going to use this one. And I go in here and I copy this code. Basically, I'm going to paste it in here. So I'm going to replace my background color. I'm going to save the document, and this is our bar right now. Let's say our container has a width of 80% and our bar takes up 100% of the available width. So the next thing we are going to do is animate our bar. And what we can do to do so is use the add keyframes method to define a function, and let's say animate bar is the name of our function. We are going to start from a width of 0% and we're going to a width of 100%. And now we use this function or this animation to define the animation for our bar, and we say we want to have the animation animate bar over 8 seconds, for example. We want to have an ease in out timing function, and we are going to save this. And as you can see, we now have our animated progress bar. Obviously, you could make the animation more complex, but I think this works perfectly fine for the showcase of how this works. Today, I show you how to create those cards with HTML and CSS. First of all, we create a div with the class card, and inside of this card, we'll have an h2 that, for example, says my skills. And we'll also add a paragraph that has 50 words, for example, and we'll just use some placeholder words. So now let's go inside of CSS and start to target our card by using the .card notation. And now we'll say inside of here that we want to have a width of 40%. We want to have a color of white to have white text. We want to have text align of center to center our text. And we want to use some padding of 40 pixels for now. Let's use a font family of Gill Sans MT whatsoever, but you can use pretty much anything. Let's go ahead and start to target our H2, and let's give it a margin bottom of 40 pixels, for example. Maybe that's a little bit too much, so let's add 20 pixels, and like this, it should be perfectly fine. So let's create a background for our element, and we can do so by using the background property, and we'll say we want to have a conic gradient. And you don't have to do this, but this looks pretty cool in my opinion, so feel free to try it out. And we are going to define a start value and an end value. And the left one is basically the start value and the right one is the end value. And now let's choose a different value, and let's say we want to use 21, 21, 21, which is just a darker gray if you want to say so. And let's use 24, 24 and 24 here, and that is a lighter gray. And now let's say we want to have the left value from 0 degrees to 180 degrees. And as you can see, we now have a lighter gray on the left side and a darker gray on the right side. You can obviously use any colors you want, and I think this effect looks pretty cool, so I wanted to show it to you. So next up, let's create our border that is animated. And we can do so by using dot card and now colon after to create an after element. We say we want to have a content that is basically empty, so we need no content at all for this one. We use position relative on the card element and position absolute on our card after element to position our after element absolute or relative, if you want to say so, to our card element. We're going to save this. We're going to define a background, and I just want to show you how this works. So we'll use a background of red for now, and I want to have an inset of 3 pixels for now. And as you can see, we now have this red background. And now I want to show you how this works. We now have this red background, and if we use set index of -1, this is going to shift our card after element behind our card element. So this red background will now shift behind our card element, and you should see the content again. And I'm going to press save, and as you can see, it's now behind. We need to use -3 pixels though for the inset, and now you can see our background is slightly bigger than our card. So we now have this red border, which is theoretically not really a border, it's theoretically just a background that is hidden behind our content. Now let's just use 1 pixel, but obviously you could also use 3 pixels, and I'll show you the difference in a second. And instead of a static background like using red, we're again going to use a conic gradient, and we'll copy our values from our background. So we take our background values and we'll paste them in here a couple of times, maybe like 6 times. Obviously you can do it as often as you want, and you'll see the difference anyways in a second. So now we can say we want to have the background color here for maybe 2 parts of the gradient, and now for the third part we want to go to yellow, for example. And as you can see, we now have this yellow border. Now we're going to have 2 parts of dark gray background again, and then we want to change to red, for example. And we're going to save, and now we probably want to have 2 parts of gray again, and our third part is going to be blue, for example. So we select blue, and this is how it's going to look. Wait, I need a comma here. And now it works. Or it doesn't work because I have a typo here, and now it should work, as you can see. But maybe we need to move this one up. And yeah, this is how it can basically look like. So obviously the animation is still missing. And how are we going to do this? First of all, we can define a method that animates our border basically, and we can do so by using the from keyword inside of our conic gradient. And now we want to say we want to use a variable that is the angle variable, and we'll use this angle variable to animate this border. And we say whatever this angle is basically the angle of our gradient, and by animating the angle basically we move our gradient in a circle, and you'll see it in a second and it will make sense to you, at least I hope so. Okay, so let's go and say we want to use add property to define the angles property, because we first of all need to define it. We say we want to define the angles property. We want to use a syntax, and this syntax is basically the angle syntax, like so. Now we want to say that we want to have an initial value of 0 degrees, and we basically want to have a full rotation, so we are going from 0 degrees to 360 degrees. And we'll have inherits of false. Now we can use add keyframes. We use an identifier. That identifier could be rotate, for example, and this is basically the animation we are going to create, and we're going to create an animation from an angle of 0 degrees to an angle of 360 degrees, because as I already mentioned, we want to have a full rotation. Now we're going to save this, and now we'll take this animation, we're going into our after cut, we're going to use animation, rotate, 4 seconds for one full animation. We want to have a linear animation, so the animation should progress at a constant pace, and we want to have infinite for the loop time, because it should loop basically forever. And I have a typo right here. We need to use dash angle, and now it's going to animate once we save. And if you want to have a cool glow effect around this border, you can do so by using this exact same syntax, but we are going to replace the after selector with the before selector. And now we're going to save, and instead of having this exact same syntax, we are just going to add one property, which is the filter property. We're going to add a blur, and we can obviously use a blur of 20 pixels, which is a lot and probably will look terrible, but this is something you can do, and actually to me it looks a lot better than I expected. But you can also use a smaller number, like 3 pixels for example, and now you just have a subtle blur. And obviously you can change the inset however you want. You can, for example, use 4 pixels, and now you have a much bigger inset. Obviously you would need to change it right here as well, and now you have this effect, for example. So you can create whatever effect you want, and some of them look really cool, some of them, yeah, probably don't. Let's build this grid inside of CSS. As you can see, the grid is also responsive. As the place shrinks, the images also adapt to the space available. And creating this grid is really super easy. First of all, we're going to create a div with the class of container, and inside of this div, we create another div with the class of gallery. Inside of this div, we'll now define or link all of the images we want to use, and I've already prepared 8 images for this purpose. So we're going to start with image 1, and we'll duplicate this image a couple of times. Now we'll say we want to have image 2, image 3, image 4, image 5, image 6, image 7, and image 8. So we have 8 images right now. And now we want to go into CSS to start styling our container and our gallery. Our container should have a width of 80% and a margin of auto, which basically centers our container. So now our gallery is basically in the center of the screen, but it doesn't really work, as you can see, and that has a couple of reasons. First of all, we need to target our gallery and say that we want to use display of grid. To define that we want to use a grid, and we need to define how many columns we want to use. And here we are going to use repeat, because we want to repeat some columns a certain amount of times, and in our case we are going to say auto fit, which will auto fit the columns, and we want to use min max, which defines a min and a max value for the columns. So we want to say the minimum value for the width is 250 pixels and the maximum value is 1 fraction of the available space. And as you can see, if I'm going to maximize the window, we basically have this grid, which looks terrible right now. So let's say our images inside of our gallery have a width of 100% and a aspect ratio of 1:1. So we basically get those squares. Now we also want to add a gap to our gallery of 30 pixels, for example, and now we have this gap. And now we could also try to maximize our window, and we basically have this gallery. So maybe instead of 80%, let's use 60%, so it looks cool when we have a full screen like this. So 4 images below 4 images, if you want to say so. One thing you can also add is use an object fit of cover, because right now you see our image is kind of stretched right here, and once we use object fit of cover, it is going to cover the image and not stretch the images, and like this, images look pretty cool. And this is all you need to know to create a cool gallery inside of CSS and HTML. Today we create this effect in CSS and HTML. First of all, we create a container class for all of our elements. Inside of this container class, we create a class with the name heading, and inside of this heading class, we create an h1 that says cool, for example. Right below this heading class, we create 5 spans. So we take one and we give this span the style of //i:1. And now we'll duplicate the span 4 times and we'll give the second span the class 2, 3, 4, and 5. Now we start by styling our heading, and we go into our style sheet. We'll target our heading. We give it a color of white, for example, a font family of monospace, and we say that we want to have a font size of 16 pixels, for example. Now we want to have a letter spacing of probably 1 character, and like this it looks pretty good. Let's go into our index again, and now we want to target our spans. So we are going to target our container, and inside of this container we'll target our spans. Now inside of these spans we want to say that our container, first of all, has a width of 300 pixels and a height of 200 pixels. And inside of our span we want to say that our span should take 100% of the width, 100% of the height, and our container has a position of relative, so our spans can have a position of absolute inside of our container. Obviously, I should also say that our heading should have a display of flex and justify center and align items of center, so it is in the center. And obviously also a width of 100% and a height of 100%, so it's really centered. And now our heading is in the center, and I can visualize our spans for you so you get a better understanding of what we're doing. So we basically have our h1, this is our heading, and this is our container. And inside of this container we have those spans that are taking up 100% of the space, but right now they are not aligned properly. As you can see, they are aligned below our container. So let's say we have a position of absolute here, so we can say top 0 and left 0, which should align our containers at the top left. And now it works, as you can see. Now let's add a transform property, and we say rotate of 72 degrees, and we take 72 degrees because 72 times 5 is 360, so this makes basically one circle. And you'll see why we do this in a second. Now we are going to multiply this with a variable, and this variable is our I variable, which we've defined right here. So we have 5 I variables, if you want to say so, but we also need to put this one into our calculate function so that this really works. And now, as you can see, every container has a slight rotation that is a multiple of 72 degrees basically. So you might ask why, but you'll actually see in a second. We are now going to create a container span after element to create some content after, and we'll say we have a content that is basically empty. We'll have a width of 22 pixels, a height of 22 pixels, and let's say a background color of yellow. The background color doesn't really matter too much. Now let's give this one a position of absolute as well, and now you can see why we basically used this after element combined with our rotate function, because now we basically rotated every single container, every single span. And now with the after pseudo element, we can basically create 5 squares that are slightly rotated and therefore have a similar spacing, or the exact same spacing if you want to be precise. So let's give our elements a border radius of 3 pixels, for example. And now I want to create more of those squares next to those squares. And we can do so by using the box shadow property, and I'll show you in a second. So we can basically go ahead and say we want to have a box shadow that has an X offset of 30 pixels, for example, 0 for Y, 0 for blur, and we'll take yellow. And now you could create a blur, so basically a glow for every single element, by saying you have a 30 pixel blur here, for example. And as you can see, now it's basically glowing. But for the purpose of this tutorial, to really explain it as fast as possible and show it as fast as possible, I'll basically leave the box shadow away. So now we have one to the right. Let's do another one to the left. So now we have a box shadow at the right and one at the left. So let's keep going by adding one at the top, and we can do so by using the Y offset and removing that one here. So we have an X offset of 0, a Y offset of 30 pixels, and a blur of 0 again. So we copy this once again, paste this right here, and now we'll have a Y offset of -30. And now we have those squares basically. The next thing we want to do is add the rotation animation, and we can do so by using add keyframes. Identifier is our move method, for example, or our move animation. We now say that we want to animate from, and we'll add a filter, and that filter is a hue rotate, and we say we want to add from 0 degrees to, we copy this line, and we say we want to have a hue rotate to 360 degrees. And as you can see, I'm going to take this method name now, and I'll add that one as an animation with a duration of 4 seconds and a timing function of linear delay of 0 and an infinite iteration count to our container span. We will now have that animation right here. And as you can see, it's basically animated. But I actually want to add a delay. So I'm going to add a delay right here by again using calculate. And again, we say we want to have a delay of probably 1.6 seconds. And we want to multiply this with our variable that we've defined earlier. So we're going to use var --i. Now, as you can see, the hue changes separately for every single element. And now we can probably say that we want to have a animation duration of 8 seconds. But we want to add something else as well. We want to add transform and the rotate property, and we'll start at 0 degree again, and we are going to transform or basically rotate up to 360 degrees. And as you can see, this is our rotation around our text. Now we also want to rotate every single one of those elements individually, and we can do so by using the move method and also add that animation to our span after element basically. And now we should maybe also add infinite right here and make our animation timing a little bit less. So we say we have 5 seconds. And now as you can see, it rotates around itself and it rotates around the text. All we have to add now is basically a hover effect once we hover over our container. So we say container :hover. And once we hover over our container, we want to add our span : after element. And we can do so by taking the box shadow. We basically want to change the box shadow in this case. And instead of just having a distance of 30 pixels in the X direction, for example, we could say we want to have 100 pixels here, for example, and we want to have -100 pixels right here. And once we hover, you can see that our cubes basically start to float into different directions. So now let's also add a transition property of, for example, all is 2 seconds. And as you can see, now the transition is basically smooth. So let's say this one has a gap of 100 pixels as well, and this one as well. And now we have this effect basically already. If you want to create more of those cubes, you could just copy those lines, for example, separate them with a comma and paste them in. And now you could, for example, say you want to replace 100 with 300 pixels, for example. And once you've done, you'll have more squares that will float basically further away. And this is the effect you get. Obviously, you can be creative and do whatever you want, but this is basically how it works and how you can create this effect in CSS and HTML. Today, we create this loading animation. To get started, we create a container div by giving it the container class. Inside of this container class, we create 3 circles, and we give each circle the class of circle. We duplicate the circle twice, so we have 3 circles, and now we go into CSS and target our circle class by using .circle. We give it a width of 40 pixels, a height of 40 pixels, a background color of white, and now we save the file, and we have those 3 squares right now. So let's turn them into circles by using border radius of 50%. And now let's align them horizontally by using our container class and say that our container has a display of flags. Now they are aligned horizontally, and now we use the gap property to define a gap of probably 20 pixels, and now we have a gap of 20 pixels between our circles. The next thing we want to do is add an animation, and we can do so by using add keyframes, and we'll give our animation a name of cycle, we define our state at 0%, and we say at 0% we want to have a transform translate y property of 0, which basically means our circle is just going to stay wherever it is. We'll add a state for 50% of the animation, and we say that now we want to have our translate y property to be at -20 pixels, which means it is going to move slightly upwards. And at the end of our animation, so at 100%, we want our circle to be at the initial position once again, so we'll set it to 0 once again. And now let's give this animation to our circle class. By using animation, let's define a name of cycle, duration is 1 second, timing function is ease in out, iteration count is infinite, and we can for now actually delete the rest. And you will see what this is going to do. So as you can see, now all of our circles are moving up and down. But now we have to add a delay for every circle, so that the first circle starts first, the second circle starts second, and the third circle starts third. And we can do so by using dot circle colon nth child, and we'll say we want to have our first child. And now we just copy this animation right here, delete it, paste it in here, and now we say we want to have a delay of 0, so we can just keep it like that. Now we want to do the same for our second child by entering a second here, and now we want to do the same for our third child by using a 3 right here. And obviously this is like pretty buggy right now, but once we reload it should work. And now we want to add a delay for our second and our third child, and we can do so by using a delay of 0.2 seconds right here. And now we can use a delay of 0.4 seconds for our third child. And now we have this loading animation. And it is basically as easy as that. Today I'll show you how to create this modal that you can open and close with only HTML and CSS. Let's imagine we have this extra info button and we want to click this button and get a modal that shows us some extra information, for example. So we can do so by creating another div, for example, and this one has the ID of modal, for example. And inside of this modal, let's imagine we want to have a paragraph that says extra information, for example, and then we want to have some extra information. So maybe let's just use some placeholder text, for example. And at the bottom of this modal, we will have another button of type button that will say close modal, for example. And as you can see right now, we're seeing this modal. So what we have to add to this div is basically the attribute popover, like so, and we can delete this. And now as you can see, our popover is basically gone. And now to our button, we can add the class or the attribute, to be precise, of popover target. And now we can add the target for this button, and the target is basically our ID of modal. So you need to add an ID right here, and this should be the ID of the modal you basically want to open. So we'll add modal to this one, and now once we click, we get this modal, which obviously looks terrible. So we're going to style our modal. We say hashtag modal has a width of 400 or 300 pixels. We have a padding of 20 pixels, a border of maybe 0, border minus radius maybe of 10 pixels. Let's maybe use some more of this. And now let's also start to style our class modal heading and class modal description. We are going to copy that one, and first of all we say dot modal minus heading will have a font weight of bold, a font minus size of 20 pixels, for example. We are going to open it, and as you can see, it looks like this right now. Let's use 30. Yeah, I think our modal description is kind of right. It doesn't have to be perfect as well. So what we're going to do now is we're going to place our modal in the center of the screen. So we use position absolute, left 50%, top 50%. Now it is basically right here, and now to get it into the center, we're going to use transform, translate x minus 50%, and translate y minus 50% to get it into the center, and now it's in the center. So obviously this would not be necessary, and it's not like, obviously you could also put the modal to the top right here or wherever you wanted to. Now let's also style our button by giving it a class of btn, for example. Now we're going to say .btn has a width of 100%, a margin top of maybe 10 pixels, a border radius of 5 pixels, and let's just open it. And as you can see, it looks like this. So let's give it a padding 15 pixels into every direction, outline 0, border 0. Now we have this modal. Obviously you could style this button pretty much in any way you wanted to, but I think for the purpose of this demo it's definitely fine. And now if you want to close this modal, what you can do is add a pop over target action to our button and say the target action is hide. And we also need to add a pop over target right here, and for this one the pop over target is also modal. So we are going to open it and we are going to close it. So the pop over target is basically the target you want to target, if it makes sense like this. And the pop over target action basically tells you, do you want to hide it? Do you want to show it? And if you don't have anything, it's basically just means you're going to show it.